Good evening, and welcome to tonight's journey into the quieter corners of ancient history. As you settle in, let your thoughts drift far back in time, to a world of marble villas, olive groves, and slow-moving rivers. A world where the Romans faced threats not only from enemies, but from nature itself. This is the story of how they met one of their most persistent adversaries, malaria. Not with panic, but with steady rituals, gentle remedies, and a determination to keep life moving forward. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let this story unfold like a soft breeze across a summer landscape. Chapter 1. A Persistent Summer Fever. In the warm months when the Tiber River shimmered beneath the Italian sun, the Romans knew that a certain kind of illness would soon appear. They called it febris intermittens, the intermittent fever. To us, it is malaria, but to them it was simply the price of living near fertile lowlands, where standing water collected in hidden pools, and unseen dangers drifted on the evening breeze. On the outskirts of Rome, near the marshes that later generations would call the Pontine, a villa stood among the olive trees. It belonged to Lucius Varro, a senator known for his mild temper and love of books. In the late afternoons, Lucius often walked along the colonnade that ringed his garden, feeling the hot air on his skin and watching the lizards dart across the paving stones. Each year, as summer deepened, he noticed the same signs. The servants grew listless. The children of the household, usually so quick to play, began to complain of headaches and chills. And every morning, the kitchen slaves carried buckets to empty the water that gathered in the basins and troughs overnight. Lucius was no physician, but he had read enough to know that stagnant water and warm air made a dangerous combination. Pliny the Elder, whose works he consulted often, described how the marshes bred sickness. Celsus, in his compendium, advised that those who lived near swamps should take special care with their diet and their sleeping arrangements. In truth, no one fully understood how the fever spread. The Romans believed in vapors, miasma, the subtle exhalations of earth and water that carried disease. They did not know of the tiny winged insects that bred in the shallows and crept through the lattice screens at night. But their instincts taught them something important: to stay calm, to prepare in advance, and to follow the rhythms of the season. So when the first cases appeared, when a stable boy began to shiver uncontrollably in the afternoon heat, Lucius set in motion the quiet rituals his household had observed for as long as he could remember. First, the servants carried fresh rushes into the sleeping quarters, spreading them across the floors to absorb dampness. The women hung sprigs of rosemary and wormwood from the beams, believing the strong scents would counteract the invisible poison. At dusk, when the air grew heavy, everyone gathered indoors. The shutters were drawn, the lamps lit, and the small braziers filled with burning herbs. The smoke drifted through the rooms in pale coils, smelling of bitter leaves and resin. Though the fumes sometimes made the children cough, they brought reassurance, too, the sense that something was being done. In the kitchen, the cook prepared lighter meals. Barley porridge, simmered slowly, a broth made with lentils and a dash of vinegar. According to Celsus, those afflicted with fever should avoid rich meats and too much wine. The body, he wrote, needed moderation above all. For Lucius, the most comforting ritual was reading. In the quiet hours after dinner, he would sit with his scrolls unrolled on a low table. Sometimes he recited passages to his wife, Flavia, whose grandmother had survived many such summers. Flavia never showed alarm, only a quiet determination that they would endure as before. The children, drowsy with heat, listened to their father's measured voice and the crackle of the brazier. Perhaps the sound itself was part of the cure, a reminder that life went on, even when sickness hovered at the threshold. In the mornings, when the first light gilded the tiled roof, the household stirred early to clean every surface. They believed the damp air of night left harmful residues, so they scrubbed the doorways with salt water and washed the thresholds with vinegar. The work was tedious, but it offered a kind of solace, a way to feel less helpless in the face of nature. Outside, the fields lay green and deceptively tranquil. The The olives swelled on their branches. The bees worked the blossoms of the kitchen garden. Only the marshes, with their motionless pools and haze of insects, hinted at the danger lurking in the warm months. By midsummer, more of the household began to show symptoms. A maid developed a hot flush in her cheeks each afternoon. One of the gardeners took to his bed, unable to stand without trembling. Flavia supervised their care, arranging cool cloths and encouraging them to drink water flavored with a little honey and vinegar. There was no panic. The Romans had seen this too often. Instead, there was a steady acceptance that some would grow sick, and most, with time, would recover. The household's physician, an elderly Greek freedman named Theodorus, moved from chamber to chamber, feeling foreheads and muttering short prayers to Apollo, the god of healing. When the fevers worsened, Theodorus prepared a bitter draught from willow bark, one of the few remedies known to ease the pains and bring down the heat. He let 10 poles escape in the same window, with one of the few remedies known to ease the pains and bring down the heat. He insisted that the sick remain in the coolest rooms, their shutters closed against the afternoon glare. Through it all, Lucius continued his evening walks along the colonnade. He knew he could not control the spread of the fever, but he could set an example. Calm, attentive, unhurried. If the gods willed that the household would survive, it would survive. And if not, they would meet the outcome with dignity. Some nights, he paused to look across the fields toward the marshes. In the silver glow of the moon, the pools looked harmless, almost beautiful, but in the depths of those still waters, countless larvae clung to life, waiting for the next chance to rise. Even without understanding the hidden cycle of the mosquitoes, Lucius sensed that the real battle was not just against fever, but against fear. The perfumed smoke, the vinegar baths, the willow bark potions, these were ways to keep hope alive, to remind themselves that the illness was neither a punishment nor a curse, but part of nature's vast, impartial design. And so, the villa settled into its summer rhythm, a quiet choreography of caution, care, and patience. Chapter 2. The Wisdom of the Marsh Watchers. To most Romans, the marshes south of the city were a nuisance, places best avoided if one valued health and good fortune. But for some, these wetlands were home. Whole generations of humble farmers, reed cutters, and fishermen had learned to live alongside the waters and the fevers that rose with them. Their knowledge, though rarely recorded in the scrolls of learned men, was treasured in the countryside. These so-called marsh watchers understood that survival lay not in panic, but in observation, preparation, and steady habits. One such man was Gaius Marius Sabinus, a tenant farmer whose ancestors had cultivated the fringes of the Pontine marshes since the days of the Republic. His dwelling was modest, a single-story house with a reed-thatched roof and walls plastered from the clay of the riverbank. In the evenings, when the last orange light of the sun glanced across the water, Sabinus would walk the perimeter of his fields, watching for any new puddle or seep that might become a breeding ground for fever. He carried a long staff and a small brass lantern. In the dusk, the flame flickered over the dark water, revealing the whorls of insects skimming the surface. Where he found a shallow pool left by the last rain, he would rake the mud with a hoe, breaking up the larvae before they could grow. This simple act, draining and disturbing the water, was one of the most effective defenses his people possessed, though they did not know why. Sabinus would say, in his blunt way, "Still water breeds ill vapor." To him, it was enough that the rule worked. As summer advanced, his neighbors came to him for advice, and his battles ground out a great deal of injustice. But most of the same, Sabinus was often backed up by these people to strive to make an example, whereas they knew that the rule worked. As summer advanced, his neighbors came to him for advice. They asked when to burn their piles of dried herbs, when to close the shutters, and whether the fever had come earlier or later than in the previous year. Sabinus never pretended to be a healer, but he knew how to read the land. If the gnats swarmed thick around the rushes by midsummer, he warned that the season would be severe. In the nearby village, women prepared their remedies. They steeped wormwood and rue in oil, then rubbed it on the children's arms and legs to repel biting insects. Old men bundled bunches of dried rosemary to burn each night. Though Roman physicians debated the usefulness of these practices, the marsh people trusted them. One evening, a young scribe named Publius visited Sabinus, tasked by a wealthy landowner to record the farmer's methods. Publius came with ink and wax tablets, eager to collect observations that might aid his patron's estates. Sabinus welcomed him with the cautious politeness of a man accustomed to being overlooked. They sat on a low bench by the door while the evening chorus of frogs and cicadas rose from the fields. "What is your greatest defense against the fever?" Publius asked, scratching a line across the wax. Sabinus did not answer at once. Instead, he gazed out across the darkening marsh. "The greatest defense," he said finally, "is remembering that the land gives and takes. You respect it. You do not grow too proud. If you forget that, you will suffer." Publius waited, hoping for a list of herbs or some novel technique to impress his employer, but Sabinus merely pointed toward the small ditch that encircled his house. "I dig that deeper each spring, so the water flows away." The scribe dutifully wrote this down, though he looked disappointed. No elaborate formula, no exotic preparation, just a trench and a watchful eye. In truth, much of the marsh watchers' wisdom was that plain. They knew which parts of the wetland to avoid after sundown. They understood that the fever struck hardest when the air was hot and still. They learned to eat lightly, to rest in the shade, and to keep their minds occupied so that dread did not become its own sickness. When a neighbor fell ill, Sabinus and his wife brought small gifts: a jar of lentil broth, a pouch of dried willow bark, a handful of lavender for the sick room. They did this not because they believed it would cure the fever outright, but because kindness was its own medicine. Some nights, as the lantern burned low, Sabinus would recall stories his grandfather told. How, in the old days, Roman engineers built canals to drain the worst of the marshes. He admired their ambition, but knew that nature could never be fully tamed. Each generation faced the same trial, and each learned anew that humility and patience were more valuable than any decree from the Senate. That summer, the fever did come early. By late June, 3 households in the village had taken to their beds. The villagers responded as they always had. Doors were shuttered in the evenings. Fires were lit to produce thick, pungent smoke. Children were kept indoors. And every morning, Sabinus walked the ditches, making sure no new pools had formed. To an outsider, these rituals might have looked futile, but to those who lived by the marsh, they were acts of quiet defiance. The fever might come, but it would not find them unprepared. When Publius departed, his tablets filled with observations, he thanked Sabinus and offered a few coins in gratitude. Sabinus accepted them with a nod, then returned to his rounds. The land required vigilance, and the marsh cared nothing for wealth or titles. In the gathering darkness, the reed beds sighed in the wind. Sabinus paused to listen, feeling the same mingling of respect and caution that had shaped his life. He did not claim to understand all the secrets of the fever, but he knew this much: a man could not conquer nature. He could only meet it with a calm mind, a steady hand, and an enduring hope that the sun would rise on healthier days. Chapter 3: The Physician's Counsel. Far from the marshes, in the heart of Rome itself, another circle of minds considered the fever. These were the physicians, men trained in the lore of Hippocrates and Galen, whose learning filled the shelves of libraries and whose opinions shaped the practices of noble households. One such physician, Marcus Livius Crispus, kept a tidy house near the temple of Aesculapius, the god of healing. His practice served senators and wealthy merchants who came seeking remedies for every manner of complaint. Though malaria febris intermittent struck rich and poor alike, those with means often hoped that the counsel of an educated man could shield them from suffering. Each summer, as the air grew heavy, Marcus prepared for the familiar procession of worried clients. They arrived in litters and on foot, escorted by slaves carrying baskets of gifts, honey, amphorae of olive oil, bolts of fine linen. These were offerings meant to secure the physician's attention and perhaps the god's favor. Marcus would greet each visitor with a quiet gravity. He never promised cures, only guidance. And in truth, much of his counsel resembled the practices of the marsh dwellers, though refined by scholarship and tradition. When a patient complained of chills and sweats, Marcus began with careful observation. He believed the body's balance of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, could be tipped by poor diet or foul air. The fever, in his view, was the result of such imbalance, worsened by the miasma that drifted from the lowlands. His prescriptions followed a measured pattern. First, the sick were ordered to rest in shaded rooms, where the air was cool and clean. Windows were draped with linen soaked in vinegar, which Marcus believed purified the atmosphere. Next came the preparation of gentle infusions. Willow bark steeped in water, a spoonful of honey to soothe the bitterness. For those who could afford it, a decoction of imported cinchona, though this bark was rare and prized for its potency. Meals were kept plain: lentils, porridge, diluted wine. Marcus instructed the household staff to avoid rich stews and sweet confections, for excess could inflame the humors and worsen the sickness. But beyond diet and draughts, Marcus also counseled calmness. He observed that patients who fretted and despaired often declined more quickly, so he recommended small rituals to occupy the mind, reciting verses from Virgil, tending a potted plant by the bedside, keeping the hands busy with weaving or small carvings. Among his wealthiest patrons was Julia Severa, widow of a prominent magistrate. When her son fell ill with fever one August, she sent an urgent summons. Marcus arrived to find the boy tossing beneath a silk coverlet, his skin damp and flushed. Servants hovered anxiously, fanning the air and murmuring prayers. With practiced composure, Marcus examined the child. He spoke softly to reassure the mother, then ordered the windows unshuttered to let in the breeze from the courtyard. He directed the servants to change the bedding, to bathe the boy's hands and face with tepid water, to place a sachet of lavender near the pillow. To Julia's surprise, he forbade the use of thick incense, which she believed would banish the disease. "Too heavy," Marcus explained gently. "It will stifle his breath." Instead, he sprinkled the floor with a thin solution of vinegar and instructed that fresh air circulate each morning. For several days, he returned at dawn and dusk, adjusting the treatment according to the boy's strength. He recorded each symptom in a neat ledger, as if the act of writing could impose order on the unpredictable course of illness. When the fever finally receded, Julia wept with relief and pressed a purse of gold into Marcus's hand. But he accepted it without triumph. He knew that for every patient who recovered, another might fail despite all efforts. Such was the nature of the malady. Back at his own house, Marcus often reflected on the limits of his art. No amount of learning could conquer the fever entirely, yet he believed there was dignity in trying, in meeting the sickness with discipline rather than terror. In quieter moments, he read the works of Galen, who wrote that the physician's task was not only to heal, but to comfort, to sustain hope when remedies ran thin. Marcus took this charge seriously. He trained his apprentices to do the same. Sometimes, when the air grew still before sunset and the city seemed to hold its breath, he would walk along the Tiber, watching the reflections of bridges ripple in the current. From there, he could glimpse the low country in the distance, where miasma gathered each summer. He knew the fever would return, as it always did, but he also trusted that the old measures, plain food, clean air, gentle herbs, would stand against it, however imperfectly. And so, year after year, Marcus continued his rounds. Though he could not abolish the illness, he brought a measure of calm wherever he went. To many, that quiet authority was worth as much as any potion. In time, his apprentices would recall how their teacher never raised his voice, never panicked when symptoms worsened. They remembered the way he would pause in a doorway, hands clasped behind his back, observing the household with steady eyes. In a city of marble monuments and noisy ambitions, Marcus Livius Crispus became known for something simpler: the belief that even an invisible enemy could be faced with patience, observation, and the conviction that no remedy was too small to try. Chapter 4: The Ritual of the Evening Fires. As the fever season lengthened, Roman households turned to rituals passed down for generations. Some were grounded in observation, others in superstition, but nearly all centered on one idea: that fire and fragrance could cleanse the air and calm the spirit. In a modest villa perched on a low hill above the Tiber, the family of Gaius and Livia Septimia kept such customs with quiet devotion. Their house overlooked a patchwork of gardens and orchard trees. In the late afternoon, when the shadows of cypresses stretched across the earth, Livia would begin her preparations. She moved with the unhurried grace of a woman who understood that small, repeated acts could shape the course of an uncertain season. Each evening, she gathered a bundle of dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, bay, and arranged them in shallow bronze dishes. The children, two slender girls with solemn eyes, watched her closely, eager to help. Together they carried the dishes to the thresholds of each room, placing them where the breeze might catch the fragrance. Then Gaius, her husband, came with a taper to light the smoldering leaves. Thin plumes of smoke curled upward, softening the lamplight and filling the spaces with their clean, resinous scent. They believed this smoke drove away the miasma, the unseen poison that drifted in from the marshes. Even without understanding the true source of malaria, they knew that households who kept to these habits often fared better. And so, they performed the ritual without complaint. Neighbors sometimes visited in the hour before dusk to see the evening fires. They came with small gifts: a jar of pickled olives, a basket of figs, a folded square of woven linen. These tokens were exchanged without ceremony, a quiet acknowledgement that everyone faced the same threat and found comfort in the same measures. On one such evening, an elderly woman named Tullia arrived, her face lined by many seasons of work and worry. She brought a cloth pouch filled with dried wormwood. "For the children's beds," she said simply, pressing it into Livia's hands. They sat together on a low bench by the courtyard, watching the fires flicker. The children played nearby, their laughter softened by the fragrant haze. Tullia spoke of her own childhood, when her mother had hung garlands of bay leaves above the doors each summer. She said the gods took pity on clean houses, she recalled, her voice thoughtful. Livia nodded, though she did not know whether the gods concerned themselves with such matters. To her, the ritual mattered less for its divine promise than for the sense of order it created. When the fires burned and the herbs smoldered, she felt the household was ready, prepared to meet whatever the season might bring. Later, as darkness settled over the villa, Gaius inspected the shutters to be sure no evening air would seep through the cracks. The girls carried small oil lamps to their sleeping quarters, their shadows tall on the walls. In each room, a dish of embers glowed softly. They understood that the smoke would fade before dawn. By then, the marsh vapors would have drifted away on the night wind, leaving the house cleansed. Or so they believed. And whether or not this faith was justified, it gave them courage. Gaius often rose before sunrise, stepping out to the courtyard while the first birds began their chorus. He would find the embers reduced to ash, the air cool and still. Sometimes he imagined that the night had carried away all danger, as if the fever itself had been persuaded to keep its distance. When the first fevers appeared in nearby households, Livia and Gaius did not alter their routine. They prepared lighter meals, soaked linens in vinegar, and continued the evening fires. The children were instructed to rest often, to drink water flavored with a little honey, and to avoid playing too long in the midday heat. Neighbors remarked on their composure. Some whispered that the family was blessed, protected by some hidden virtue. But Gaius knew the truth was simpler. It was not blessings that preserved them, but habit and watchfulness. One afternoon, a messenger came with news that a distant cousin had fallen ill. Gaius traveled to their house, bringing a jar of barley gruel and a bundle of fresh rushes. When he returned, he washed his hands with vinegar and burned a sprig of rosemary at the threshold. The children asked why he bothered with such rituals. "Because it reminds us we have some power," he told them gently, "not over everything, but over how we prepare." In the evenings, after the last chores were finished, Livia would sit by the courtyard wall and mend clothes by lamplight. The air smelled of smoke and lavender. The children played with their carved wooden dolls, their voices hushed, as if they too felt the solemnity of the season. Sometimes Gaius joined her, resting his back against the cool stone. They spoke little, content to share the quiet. In those hours, it seemed the fever could not touch them, that all the fear and uncertainty remained beyond the walls. It was an illusion, perhaps, but a comforting one. And in a time when remedies were few, such illusions were precious. When the fires burned low, Livia rose to scatter the remaining embers into the garden. She watched the last wisps of smoke rise into the night. Each evening, this simple act closed the day. An offering, a defense, a small declaration that life, though fragile, continued. In the morning, they would sweep the ash from the thresholds and begin again. And in that repetition lay their truest strength. Chapter 5. The Builders of Dry Ground. Though they did not know about mosquitoes, they observed that areas with still pools and soggy fields bred sickness. And so they built, not just to tame rivers and carry aqueducts, but to move the land itself, lowering, lifting, draining. In the low plains beyond the Aventine Hill, where the soil was thick with reeds and the air carried a constant hum of insects, a work crew labored through the dry months. Their task was as old as the Republic, digging channels to redirect runoff from a nearby hill, lining the ditches with stone to keep the water moving, and, where possible, draining the shallow pools into the Tiber. The foreman of this particular project was a veteran named Lucius Gallo. Once a legionnaire, he now took his orders from landowners who hoped to protect their crops and villas from the creeping illnesses of the warm season. With sun-leathered skin and a voice that carried across fields, Lucius knew the terrain well. He had built fortifications in Gaul, bridges across rivers in Illyricum. Now, he shaped the land beneath Rome's very walls. Each morning, he assembled his men before the mist lifted. Armed with picks, shovels, and long levels made of plumbed rope, they spread across the fields like ants on a mission. By noon, their tunics were soaked with sweat, their faces streaked with clay and dust. To the untrained eye, their work appeared simple, just trenches in the earth. But Lucius understood that everything depended on slope and speed. A ditch too shallow would gather water instead of guiding it. A curve too sharp could cause blockage after the first storm. He taught his men to listen to the land. Where frogs gathered in silence, water would pool. Where rushes grew tallest, the soil stayed wet longest. These signs mattered more than any map. Sometimes the locals brought wine or bread to the workers, in thanks, or in hope that the work might one day protect their own homes. One such visitor was an elderly farmer named Naso, who had lost 2 sons to the fever the summer before. He came walking slowly down the path, holding a small basket of dates and cheese. Lucius met him near the canal they were shaping, wiping his brow with the edge of his tunic. The old man nodded toward the ditch. "Will it help?" he asked simply. Lucius looked down the channel, where the water already trickled toward the main stream. He shrugged, not in doubt, but in honesty. "It will help," he said. "But it won't stop the marsh from breathing." That was how Lucius saw it. The marsh breathed, expanding in the rainy season, retreating during drought. It was never fully conquered, but every ditch, every stone-lined trench, was a breath denied. At midday, the workers rested beneath canvas awnings strung between posts. They drank vinegar water and ate olives, flatbread, dried figs. Lucius passed around small bundles of herbs, rue and mint, believing that chewing them helped keep the stomach steady. Superstition? Perhaps. But he had seen men fall sick more often without such small habits. When the sun sank lower, the labor resumed. At the edges of the field, boys from the nearby villa watched, fascinated. One dared to ask if he could help. Lucius handed him a small shovel and pointed to a section of loose earth. "Only if you dig straight," he said with a wink. These children would inherit the land. Lucius hoped they would also inherit the wisdom to respect it. Too many Roman nobles paid more attention to fountains and terraces than to drainage and runoff. And yet, it was the simple flow of clean water and the absence of standing pools that made all the difference in a fever season. Sometimes at dusk, Lucius would walk the completed ditches alone, listening to the soft trickle of water moving just fast enough to stay clear. He admired the way the light played along the shallow stream, how even in such a mundane task there was quiet beauty. He was so conscious that he was still so far gone. Once, during the reign of the early kings, the Romans had built the Cloaca Maxima, a vast sewer that drained the Forum itself. Lucius had seen it in his youth, marveled at the dark mouth beneath the city. Now, in his twilight years, he built its humble cousins across the countryside. He took no credit, asked for no monument, but he took satisfaction in knowing that every drop of diverted water meant fewer cases of illness, fewer funerals at the village shrine. Lucius, by the time autumn came and the ground grew firm again, his crew had shaped nearly 3 miles of trench and 3 small spillways lined with cut stone. The reeds began to thin, the mosquitoes grew fewer, and the land, as if in gratitude, began to yield more barley and grapes. When the fever struck again the following summer, it passed more lightly than before. Fewer homes went silent at dusk. The priest who kept the shrine to Apollo poured a libation in thanks, but Lucius, watching from a distance, only smiled faintly and returned to his tools. There would always be another marsh, another pool, another summer to prepare for. But the land could be shaped. The fever could be met, not with fear, but with the steady rhythm of hands that built, dug, drained, and believed that even the humblest trench could hold back a tide of suffering. I touched my temple, but I would not look at him. Chapter 6. The Gardens of Rest and Recovery. While the engineers shaped the land and the marsh watchers tended their ditches, others found a different sort of remedy, one that mingled the practical and the hopeful. In the shaded gardens of Roman villas and townhouses, the sick were tended in spaces designed as much for the mind as for the body. Among these tranquil refuges was the garden of Domitia Lucilla, a matron known in her district not only for her wealth, but for her devotion to the care of her family and servants. Her house stood near the Janiculum Hill, far enough from the river to enjoy fresher breezes. But even here, no household was spared the threat of fever when the season turned warm. Domitia believed that the mind's temper could sway the body's fate. She had learned this watching her own mother, who had survived many illnesses and always insisted on being carried into the courtyard to feel the wind on her face. When her husband fell ill one midsummer, Domitia resolved to turn their walled garden into a place of restoration. The courtyard was enclosed on all sides by colonnades, sheltering beds of herbs and flowers. Climbing vines softened the pale stucco walls. Fountains bubbled in small basins of travertine. Every element was arranged to soothe the senses: the scent of lavender, the hush of water, the gleam of sun on polished leaves. Each morning, before the heat grew oppressive, Domitia's servants swept the paths clean of fallen petals and watered the roots of rosemary and sage. She herself inspected every corner, ensuring no shallow basin or cracked tile collected standing water. Though she did not know the true nature of the fever's spread, She trusted that cleanliness was a form of defense. When her husband's fever rose, she ordered his couch carried into the eastern portico, where the dawn light fell gently. There, propped on bolsters, he could watch the swallows dart among the beams. Domitia sat nearby with her basket of mending, her quiet presence a steady reassurance. From time to time she offered small comforts, a cup of cooled barley water, a cloth soaked in diluted vinegar, a sprig of mint pressed into his palm. A physician visited in the afternoons to feel the pulse and recommend mild draughts. But Domitia believed the garden itself was medicine. Its stillness, its beauty, its air washed clean by fountains. Visitors who came to inquire after her husband's health often paused in the courtyard, momentarily forgetting their errands. Even in troubled times, the garden seemed to hold its own calm. There, illness felt less triumphant, less inevitable. Domitia kept a wooden tablet on which she marked the hours of improvement. The first night he slept without chills. The morning he managed a few bites of soft bread. The afternoon his eyes regained their clarity. These small victories were celebrated in the hush of the garden, without fanfare. Her household learned to respect the ritual. The children played their games in the outer courtyard, voices lowered as they passed the sick room. The steward took deliveries at the back gate to keep the main paths quiet. A slave girl carried fresh garlands of bay and myrtle each evening to renew the air. In this way, the garden became a threshold between fear and recovery. Domitia herself felt its influence. On the days when her heart grew heavy with dread, she would walk the flagged paths, pausing to touch the leaves and breathe the mingled scents. It reminded her that life persisted, green and fragrant, even as sickness tried to lay claim. When at last her husband's fever broke and he began to sit up unassisted, the household relaxed its vigil. Domitia did not dismiss the physician or put away the linens, for she knew the fever could return. But she allowed herself one evening to sit beside the fountain in peace, listening to the water and feeling, for the first time in weeks, the ease of unbroken breath. Word spread among her neighbors that her household had endured the fever with unusual grace. Some credited the physician's skill, others the virtue of the family's piety. But those who had visited her garden suspected the truth was simpler. The place itself, tended with patient care, had sheltered the spirit as much as the body. When a friend came seeking advice, her own husband just fallen ill, Domitia led her quietly through the colonnade. She pointed out the shaded couch, the clean flagstones, the small bowls of vinegar that scented the air. "It need not be elaborate," she said gently, "only tended with love." As the season waned and the cool winds of autumn returned, Domitia kept the garden open each afternoon. Those who had recovered from fever came to sit in the breeze and feel the last warmth of the sun. She welcomed them without ceremony, offering a place to rest and remember that illness, however terrible, did not rule every hour of life. In later years, when her children grew and the memory of that summer softened, Domitia still rose at dawn to walk the garden paths. She tended the rosemary herself, clipped back the spent blossoms, and inspected every basin for standing water. It was a habit she would never abandon, for she had seen how a simple, fragrant refuge could turn fear into resolve, and remind the sick that though they could not always choose their trials, they could choose the way they met them. Chapter 7. The apothecary's shelves beyond the city walls, in a quarter where traders from every province unloaded their goods, stood the workshop of Cassius Numitor, a quiet man whose craft was neither glamorous nor much celebrated, but who nonetheless played a vital role each fever season. Cassius was an apothecary, trained in the preparation of tinctures, pastes, and powders drawn from every corner of the known world. His shop was a cool, dim place, lined floor to ceiling with amphorae and clay jars, bundles of dried herbs tied in neat rows overhead. The air always smelled of camphor, anise, and bitter roots. He rose before dawn to measure and grind, his mortar and pestle tapping out a steady rhythm. Though he kept ledgers in precise Latin script, much of his work depended on memory, which herbs could be steeped together, which powders must be stored apart, which plants lost their virtue if dried too quickly. The fever season transformed his quiet routine into a relentless tide of demand. By mid-morning, the street outside the workshop filled with servants and anxious relatives, each holding a scrap of parchment bearing a physician's prescription. Cassius greeted each visitor with polite reserve. He listened carefully, nodded, and moved unhurried through his shelves. For a child's intermittent chills, he offered an infusion of willow bark. For the stomach weakness that often followed, a draught of mint steeped in sour wine. For exhaustion and restless sleep, powdered poppy heads, measured with cautious hands. He did not promise cures. He knew better than to claim certainty. But he took pride in his craft, in the simple faith that well-prepared remedies might tip the balance between life and loss. Sometimes, amid the steady flow of patrons, he glimpsed the quiet desperation that underpinned each request. A mother's trembling hand, a father's fixed gaze, a servant's tight grip on a coin purse. Though Cassius had seen thousands of such faces, he never grew indifferent. One afternoon, as the air outside thickened with heat, a young woman arrived at the threshold. She was plainly dressed, with the drawn look of one who had slept little. In her hand she carried a small folded note. "My husband," she said, voice soft as if she feared to wake him even from this distance. "His fever worsens each night." Cassius read the note, scribbled in the practiced hand of a physician he respected, and inclined his head. Without speaking further, he turned to his shelves. From a high nook, he drew a bundle of feverfew wrapped in linen. From a clay jar, a measure of finely ground cinchona bark. He weighed each portion carefully on a small brass scale, noting the measure with a charcoal stylus. When all was prepared, he passed the packet to the woman with precise instructions. "Steep the feverfew in warm water," he told her gently. "Half a cup every 4 hours. The powder, only as much as will cover a coin. Stir it into cooled wine, not hot." Her eyes filled with tears, but she only nodded. He did not speak of payment. There would be time enough for that, if her husband recovered. If not, he knew no fee would matter. When she had gone, Cassius returned to his workbench, where small hills of dried petals waited to be sorted. He paused for a moment, resting a hand on the smooth wooden edge. In all his years, he had learned that remedies were only part of the healing. The manner of their giving mattered too. As dusk neared, he closed the front shutter halfway, signaling that the day's commerce was drawing to a close. Yet still stragglers arrived. An old man requesting fennel for his cough, a farmhand seeking vinegar and salt to wash a wound, a matron asking for rosemary to burn in her family's chambers. He served each patiently. The last to depart was a boy sent by the priest of Apollo's shrine. In return for a measure of laurel oil, the priest would leave a small offering on Cassius's step, a garland of dried marigold to hang above the door for protection. When the street finally grew quiet, Cassius extinguished the oil lamp above his ledger. In the hush, he could hear the slow creak of the timbers as the night cooled the plaster walls. He swept the floor, wiped the counters clean of stray seeds and powder, and covered the bundles waiting for dawn. He paused a final time at the doorway, looking back over the shelves. Each jar, each bundle, each folded cloth of dried leaves represented a fragment of knowledge. Generations of trial and memory distilled into small, potent measures. He thought of the households where his preparations now sat in cups and basins, of the hopes invested in every draught. He never allowed himself to imagine too much. His role was only to provide, not to guarantee. Yet he found solace in knowing he had done his part with care. Before retiring to his small bedchamber, Cassius whispered the simple blessing his grandmother had taught him when he was just a boy apprenticed in her shop. "May all who carry these remedies find ease." And in the darkness, the words lingered, a quiet prayer over the herbs, the shelves, the countless unseen hands that would lift each tincture in the hours to come. Chapter 8. The Watchers. by the river. To those who lived close to the water's edge, the Tiber was both a source of life and a bearer of danger. It brought fish, fertile soil, and the rhythms of trade, but it also carried disease in its sluggish summer currents. When the fever season returned, the people of Rome often looked to the river with both reverence and unease. On the southern bank, near a quiet bend shaded by plane trees, stood a modest shrine to Tibernus, the river god, guardian of the waters. Each year, as the sun grew stronger and the marshes near the banks thickened with reeds, a small group of local watchers gathered daily at dawn. They came not in robes or with ritual, but with tools and bare feet, bound by a common task: to read the signs of the river. Chief among them was Aulus Marcius, an older man with skin the color of sun-baked stone and a voice like gravel. He had spent his life near the water, first as a fisherman, later as a ferryman, and now, in quieter years, as a keeper of river knowledge. The others called him simply the listener. Each morning he stepped barefoot into the shallows, watching how the current moved around fallen branches, how the insects gathered above the still pools, how the surface changed its sheen with the hour. He had no formal training, no scrolls or tablets, but he knew the moods of the Tiber as others knew the changing sky. It was said that Marcius could predict a flood by the shape of a single cloud, or tell whether the fever would rise by the taste of the air at dusk. Such claims were exaggerations, of course, but not by much. His observations were rooted in careful attention, patterns repeated year after year, quiet markers of the land's breath and the river's warnings. Others came to help and to learn. A boy named Lucan, barely 12, followed Marcius everywhere, clutching a basket for collecting samples, bits of moss, strange larvae, reeds broken open to examine for signs of infestation. Lucan's father had died of the fever the previous summer, and since then, the boy had rarely left the river's edge. They recorded what they saw with chalk on a long slate kept at the shrine. Each morning had its line: water level, smell of the wind, sightings of birds or unusual blooms. A visiting physician once remarked that it was the most consistent environmental record he had seen outside the archives of a patrician's estate. The watchers did not see their work as science, though. To them, it was vigilance, a way of showing the river that they were paying attention. And in return, they believed, the river sometimes showed mercy. One humid afternoon, a cluster of women from the nearby neighborhood arrived with offerings: small bundles of garlic, sprigs of rue, and a pitcher of rose-scented water. They laid them on the altar of Tiberinus, where weather-worn carvings still showed the flowing beard and crowned head of the god. Marcius accepted the gifts with a nod. He sprinkled the rose water at the base of the altar and murmured an old formula: for clean passage and sweet breath. The watchers were not priests, but they understood that ritual, however simple, gave structure to fear. These acts were not about appeasing the divine as much as they were about binding the community with shared purpose. As the days passed and the river grew lazier, the signs became more troubling. The water near the banks lost its clarity. Mosquitoes rose in thicker swarms. Birds that usually nested nearby had moved farther inland. Marcius noted each detail with increasing concern. He instructed Lucan and the other watchers to mark off dangerous pools and break up any surface scum with long poles. They dug shallow trenches to drain areas where runoff had collected. Children who came to swim were gently but firmly sent away. It was not easy work, but it was grounded in the quiet conviction that awareness, even without cure, could still offer protection. One evening, just before sunset, Lucan approached the shrine carrying a small ceramic bowl. Inside it floated a cluster of mosquito larvae he had scooped from a stagnant channel. Marcius studied them for a long moment. "Too many," he said softly. "Too early." That night, they lit small fires at intervals along the bank. Not to warm themselves, but to signal. The flickering flames told nearby households that it was time to take precautions. Cover the water jars, hang the perfumed cloths, stay indoors at dusk. Some obeyed, others did not. That was always the way. But still, the watchers lit their fires each night. They walked the banks, they marked the patterns. When the fever arrived, late that year but no less cruel, they continued their rounds. Not to prevent the illness, for they had no power over its path, but to remind their neighbors that someone was watching, that even as the city turned inward in fear, the river did not go unheeded. Marsyas never fell ill. Lucan did, briefly, but recovered. They never claimed it was due to their knowledge or their watchfulness. Perhaps it was luck. Perhaps it was the wind. But when the season passed and the Tiber ran clearer once again, the people of that riverside quarter brought new offerings to the shrine, not in desperation this time, but in gratitude. A basket of figs, a bronze amulet, a loaf baked in the shape of a boat. And to Marsyas, they gave a cloak of wool dyed in deep blue, the color of moving water, the color of vigilance. He wore it only once, then folded it carefully and placed it near the altar. For the next one who listens, he said. Chapter 9. The Letters of Scribonius. Far from the river banks and the marshy lowlands, in a shaded study lined with scrolls, Scribonius Atticus wrote by lamplight. He was neither a physician nor a priest. Instead, he was a clerk, one of those quiet figures who preserved knowledge in careful script. In another age, his work might have been confined to inventories and tax records. But in the fever seasons, Scribonius devoted himself to a more humane enterprise, gathering observations and remedies from across the provinces, recording them so that no wisdom, however small, would be lost. He worked in the domus of a wealthy senator who prized learning and paid generously for any account that might protect his estates. Scribonius had access to the senator's private library, a treasure trove of Greek treatises, Roman herbal manuals, and travel journals from traders who had crossed Egypt and Syria. But it was not these polished volumes he valued most. Rather, he cherished the sheaves of letters sent by common people, farmers, healers, travelers, who described in plain words what they had seen and tried. Each evening, he unrolled the latest dispatches and copied them line by line into a great ledger he called the Accounts of the Fever. One letter, creased and stained, came from a vintner near Capua. It described how smoke from burning juniper branches seemed to keep the worst of the sickness from spreading through the vineyard workers' quarters. Another came from a midwife in Ostia, who claimed that steeping linen in rosemary water before hanging it over doorways helped ease the air. Some accounts contradicted others. Scribonius did not discard them. He simply noted each, adding the place and season, the names of those who had witnessed the results. His aim was not to judge, but to record, trusting that clarity would emerge in time. Once a month, he dispatched a courier to deliver copies of the ledger to physicians and civic leaders who had requested them. Over the years, these packets of copied letters spread well beyond Rome. A scholar in Tarraco wrote to thank him, saying the collected remedies had inspired a new experiment in drainage. A healer in Carthage sent a list of local plants used in similar treatments. In this way, a clerk who never left his city became a quiet link in a chain of learning that spanned the empire. Scribonius himself led a modest life. He slept in a small chamber behind the study, took his meals in the servants' quarters, and owned no property beyond a few shelves of scrolls. Yet he felt a quiet contentment in his work. He believed that words, faithfully copied, could outlast any fever. On warm evenings, he sometimes paused in his writing to stand at the window. From there, he could see the glow of hundreds of lamps flickering across the rooftops, a reminder that every home, rich or poor, faced the same fears when the fever season came. He often thought of the people whose letters he transcribed: the widow who boiled vinegar with bay leaves, the old centurion who insisted that a poultice of barley flour and honey drew the heat from the skin, the young mother who had written with heartbreaking simplicity, "We try everything." No single remedy had proven certain, but together, these fragments formed a tapestry, a testament to the Romans' refusal to surrender without a struggle. One evening, a physician named Marcus Fabius came to visit. He had traveled from Beneventum, carrying a bundle of fresh notes. He found Scribonius at his work table, bent over the ledger by lamplight. "You labor as if each word might save a life," Fabius observed gently. Scribonius set down his pen and rubbed the fatigue from his eyes. "Perhaps it will," he said, "or perhaps it will give someone the courage to keep trying." Fabius unwrapped the bundle and spread the notes across the table. For hours, the two men sorted and copied, pausing only to sip watered wine. Fabius recounted what he had seen: small towns that burned aromatic woods, villages that dug trenches to drain the damp fields, households that washed their floors daily with vinegar. Scribonius wrote each detail carefully, his script unhurried. He felt no impatience. He had learned that knowledge gathered slowly was often the most enduring. When dawn began to pale the sky, Fabius prepared to depart. He clasped Scribonius's hand, thanking him for his diligence. "You do more good than you know," he said quietly. After the physician left, Scribonius returned to his seat. He regarded the ledger, its thick pages dense with script, and felt a calm satisfaction. It was not a cure, but it was a record. And in times of fear, records mattered. They reminded the living that their struggles were neither solitary nor forgotten. Later that morning, as the city stirred to life, a boy arrived with a fresh packet of letters from the southern ports. Scribonius accepted them gratefully, already reaching for his pen. In the silent study, among the shelves of scrolls and the scent of ink and dried herbs, he resumed his quiet task, patiently gathering the scattered wisdom of an empire, line by line, so that no small act of care would vanish unremembered. Chapter 10. The Rituals of the Hearth. Though the city's grand physicians and river watchers played their parts in the struggle against fever, much of the daily defense unfolded in humbler places, in kitchens and hearths, where ordinary people wove small rituals into their routines. In a narrow lane of the Sabura district, where apartments rose high and the air grew thick in summer, lived a potter's family. Their rooms were modest, a single chamber for sleeping, a kitchen no larger than a market stall, and a corner where the father shaped clay. The matron of this household, Aelia, was not learned in herbs or scrolls. She had never studied under a healer or traveled beyond the city gates, but she possessed the quiet, practical wisdom that grows in any home where children must be kept fed and safe. Each year, as the fever season approached, Aelia began her preparations. She scrubbed the walls with water steeped in vinegar and lavender. She washed every garment and laid fresh reeds on the sleeping pallets. She hung small cloth sachets filled with mint and wormwood over the door lintels. Her neighbors sometimes teased her for her diligence. "You'll scour the color from your walls," they joked. But when the first cases were reported nearby, many came to her door to ask advice. "Tell me again how you boil the vinegar," they would say, "or what do you put in those little bags?" She answered patiently, never claiming her efforts were a sure protection. "It is what my grandmother taught me," she would reply, "and perhaps it helps." At dawn, before the others woke, she lit a small brazier and burned sprigs of rosemary and juniper. The rising smoke carried a sharp, clean scent that filled the kitchen and drifted into the sleeping chamber. While it burned, she whispered a simple invocation, not to any god in particular, but to the spirit of the hearth itself. "Keep our breath clear," she murmured, "and our bodies strong." Some would have called it superstition. Aelia did not care. She believed that such rituals anchored her resolve and reminded the household that vigilance began in the smallest acts. When her husband returned each evening from the workshop, weary and dust-streaked, she insisted he wash his hands and face with vinegar before touching the children. At meals, she poured wine mixed with honey and warm water, believing it gentler on the stomach. And each night, she wrapped the youngest children in clean linen, whispering promises that they were safe. One week in late summer, the fever swept through the apartments along their lane. Neighbors fell ill, one by one. Aelia did not retreat. She prepared barley water for the sick, carried messages to the physicians, and took in the daughter of a neighbor who had no family left to care for her. In her kitchen, she set aside a space for the girl's bedding, near the hearth where the warmth was steady. She washed her each morning, brushed her hair, and spoke to her in a low, comforting voice. The child grew stronger in time, though thin and pale. When the fever finally eased, the girl remained in Aelia's care. No one questioned it. In times of illness, households were reshaped by necessity, and love often stretched to include whomever needed it. Later that autumn, a wandering priest stopped at their lane. He had heard of Aelia's care for the sick and brought a small offering, a clay amulet shaped like a stylized eye for protection, he told her. Aelia accepted it politely but set it aside on a high shelf. She did not rely on charms. Her faith rested in soap, vinegar, clean air, and the constancy of her own hands. Yet that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, she took the amulet down and studied it in the lamplight. She thought of all the small things people did to push back the dark. Herbs, prayers, burning branches, and whispered words. Perhaps, she decided, they all had power in their way. Before she lay down, she hung the amulet by the kitchen door. Not because she believed it would ward off every illness, but because it reminded her that in every home, even the humblest, there was a place for hope. And as the night winds cooled the city, she felt a quiet assurance. The fever would return, as it always did, but so would she. Ready to clean, to tend, to sit beside the hearth, and do what could be done. In the long story of Rome's struggles with sickness, her name would never appear in ledgers or inscriptions. But among her neighbors, Aelia was remembered as the woman whose household remained open to any in need, and whose vigilance was as steady as the lamp she kept burning in the darkest weeks of summer. Chapter 11. The Offerings to Apollo. In the heart of Rome, near the Palatine Hill, stood the grand temple of Apollo Medicus, whose columns gleamed white against the blue of the summer sky. Though the fever season inspired many private rituals in humble kitchens and courtyards, the city also turned to this public sanctuary when hope grew thin. At dawn, the priests swept the temple steps clean of dust. They arranged fresh laurel branches in brass urns and refilled the shallow basins with water scented by crushed rosemary. From the portico, one could look down across the city's tiled roofs, the Tiber's winding gleam, and the green smudge of distant fields, an expanse both beautiful and, in these months, quietly menacing. People arrived all through the morning, patricians in pale tunics, freedmen carrying baskets of offerings, servants sent with small coins wrapped in scraps of linen. They came not merely to seek healing, but to remind themselves that the gods had not turned away. Among them was Septimus Labeo, a scholar who spent most of the year in quiet study. He had never considered himself devout. His faith was a measured thing, more respect for tradition than belief in intervention. But in that fever season, when his younger brother fell sick and lay insensible for days, Septimus discovered how much comfort a temple could offer. He came alone, carrying a small votive figure fashioned of wax. Its blank, featureless head and slender body were meant to represent any afflicted soul. At the altar, he placed it beside dozens of others, some molded in clay, others carved of olive wood. Each bore silent testimony to the city's collective fear. He watched as a priest in a white robe approached the offerings. With practiced solemnity, the man sprinkled each figure with a mixture of wine and oil, murmuring invocations to Apollo. Some without, some within, he stayed with each one. He did not hurry. Every gesture was precise, dignified, serene. Nearby, a chorus of acolytes began to chant. Their voices rose in slow, measured cadences, drifting across the courtyard like a balm. Septimus felt the tightness in his chest ease. not because he believed the ritual would banish illness, but because the act itself reminded him that he was not alone. All morning, the priests continued their work. They accepted garlands of bay leaves, amulets stamped with the god's image, small loaves shaped like kidneys or hearts, each a symbol of the body part in need of healing. They made note of each petitioner's name on thin sheets of wax. Later, the records would be copied to scrolls and stored in the temple archives. By midday, the heat grew oppressive. A breeze stirred the scented smoke rising from brass braziers, carrying it across the steps. Septimus lingered in the shadows, watching as a woman approached with her son. The boy was frail, leaning heavily on her arm. The mother held a sprig of laurel, its leaves bound with a strip of dyed wool. She pressed it into the priest's hand and knelt beside her child. The priest did not ask questions or offer reassurance he could not guarantee. He simply laid a hand on the boy's head, his eyes closing as he spoke a blessing. For a moment, the courtyard felt utterly still. No cries of gulls, no clatter from the streets, only the hush of shared entreaty. Later that day, Septimus returned home. He found his brother sleeping more peacefully than he had in many days. The fever had not yet broken, but the lines of pain in his face had eased. Septimus sat beside him in the dim room, the cool air moving through the shutters. He did not know whether Apollo had intervened, but he felt steadier, able to endure the hours ahead. In the weeks that followed, the fever rose and fell in unpredictable waves. Sometimes, whole households fell ill together. Other times, a single person sickened while the rest remained untouched. Each dawn, the temple received new offerings. Each dusk, the priests lit lamps along the portico, so that even in darkness the sanctuary glowed. Some scoffed at the rites, calling them empty superstition, but many others understood that faith, however fragile, could be a shield of its own kind. The rituals gave shape to fear, turned inchoate dread into action. Whether or not the god's favor descended, the people could say they had tried, all that could be tried. By the end of the fever season, when cooler winds began to stir and the river cleared, the temple steps were heaped with the remains of offerings: wilted wreaths, cracked clay figures, coins dulled by weather. The priests gathered these with care. The votive objects were burned in a designated pit beyond the temple walls, a final act of release, returning the supplicants' hopes to the unseen. Septimus watched this quiet disposal from a distance. He thought of the wax figure he had left, now reduced to ash. He did not feel despair. Rather, he felt a solemn gratitude that in a time of helplessness, there had been a place to lay his fears down. Years later, when he had grown old, and the memory of that fever had softened into the stories he told his grandchildren, he still kept a sprig of dried laurel in his study, not as proof of divine intervention, but as a remembrance of a time when all Rome, from senator to beggar, came together to petition a god for mercy, and found in the asking a measure of peace. Chapter 12. The island that waited off the western bend of the Tiber River lay a narrow stretch of land, almost forgotten by the rush of the city around it. Tiber Island, shaped like a boat run aground, had long held a curious place in Rome's imagination. It was not merely geography. It was a space of memory, of healing, and of quiet purpose. Centuries earlier, legend held, the island had formed from sheaves of grain tossed into the river after the fall of the tyrant King Tarquin. Centuries earlier, legend held, the island had formed from sheaves of grain tossed into the river after the fall of the tyrant King Tarquin. Whatever the truth, the island came to symbolize refuge, sacred ground, where both storm and sickness might lose their edge. By the time the fever seasons became a regular rhythm in Roman life, the island housed a sanctuary unlike any other. It was here that the temple of Aesculapius had been built, after the god of healing was said to have arrived in the form of a serpent. A colonnade surrounded the central altar, and courtyards opened onto shaded gardens where the ill could rest. But more than a temple, the island had become a place of observation. The priests and attendants, unlike those in other sanctuaries, were trained to notice. They watched how fevers rose and fell, what herbs soothed, what rituals seemed to steady a pulse or ease the lungs. Their strength lay not in divine miracles, but in attentive repetition. Cassia Valeria was one such attendant. She was not a priestess, technically, not even of noble lineage, but she had been taken in as a child after losing her parents to the fever. She had grown up in the temple gardens, learned the names of the healing herbs, and spent hours watching the older attendants measure pulse and breath. By the time she was 20, Cassia was known simply as the one who listens. She did not claim to heal. Instead, she sat at the bedsides of the ill, held their hands, and noted their words, whether delirious or lucid. She knew that healing was often slow, and that the sick feared silence more than pain. Each morning, she rose before the sun and walked the gardens barefoot, touching the leaves of rue and hyssop, tasting the wind. She helped prepare the daily infusion, a warm broth of barley, honey, and herbs, served to each patient before the day grew hot. Later, when she went to death's door, she found Alex sitting upright in bed, her hands clasped behind her back. A minute later, she noticed that Hale sang to him the words lascivi, which saved him from the daily infusion. A warm broth of barley, honey, and herbs served to each patient before the day grew hot. She believed that care, offered gently and consistently, could nudge the body toward calm. Some days, the sick arrived in droves, carried across the narrow bridge on makeshift stretchers, their families whispering prayers as they passed through the temple's stone gates. Other days, the island lay in stillness, the only sound the splash of river water against its banks. Cassia kept a journal, though no one had asked her to. In it, she wrote simple notes, the names of patients, the sequence of their symptoms, the treatments tried. She wrote not for glory, but so the patterns might not be lost when memory faded. One summer, a young senator's son was brought to the island. He was gaunt and trembling, his eyes fever-bright. His father had spared no expense. There had been physicians, perfumed linens, even visits from augurs. But the boy remained sick. In desperation, they turned to the island. Cassia sat with him each day. She offered no promises, only presence. She fed him barley broth, cooled his forehead with cloths dipped in rosewater, and told him stories. Tales of her childhood among the temple trees, of a cat that had once taken up residence in the herb shed, of the breeze that always came just before sundown. The boy listened. He began to sleep more deeply. His fever did not vanish overnight, but it receded, slowly, like a tide withdrawing. When he could stand, she walked with him through the gardens. "This place," he whispered, "feels like it remembers." Cassia smiled. "It does." By the end of the season, he had recovered enough to return home. Before he left, he placed a carved tablet in the offering hall. It read simply, "To the island that waited." Over time, word of the island's quiet work spread, not as a place of miraculous cures, but of steadiness, of care, given without spectacle. When fear returned with each fever season, families spoke of it not with desperation, but with hope. Cassia continued her work. She grew older, and new attendants came to learn from her. She showed them not only how to prepare remedies, but how to sit without speaking, how to touch her wrist without startling, how to wait beside someone who did not yet know whether they would live. Eventually, when her own hair had grown silver, Cassia fell ill. She refused to be taken to the city. Instead, she remained in the island gardens, beneath the trees she had known since childhood. The attendants, who had learned from her, now cared for her. They offered her barley broth, cooled her forehead, and held her hand as she once had held so many others. She did not survive that fever, but after her passing, her journal was placed in the temple archives, alongside records from centuries past. A page had been marked with a ribbon, one she had placed herself years before. On it was written a single line: "Healing does not always come through cure. Sometimes it comes through kindness, repeated." And so, the island remained. Seasons came and went. The fever returned and retreated. But the temple stood, and the attendants waited, ready not with magic, but with patience. Chapter 13. The Merchant's Bargain. In the bustling Forum Boarium, where traders crowded around stalls of oil, fish, and imported spices, the fever season arrived like a quiet shadow. At first, the merchants carried on as always, haggling over amphorae of garum, weighing sacks of grain, shouting prices above the din. But soon, rumors spread, of men who had collapsed in the midday heat, of children coughing through the night. Among the merchants was Lucius Vinicius, a man who had earned respect for the quality of his wares and the fairness of his dealings. He was no healer, nor particularly pious, but he had a gift for observation. He knew when olives were about to spoil, when the air held too much damp, when a customer's purse was lighter than their promises. That same keen watchfulness turned now to the sickness creeping through the quarter. Lucius did not panic. He had seen fevers come and go before. Instead, he began to make quiet arrangements. He ordered fresh rushes for the floor of his stall, burned small braziers of juniper and laurel to sweeten the air, and set aside jars of vinegar to rinse hands and tools. When neighboring merchants complained that these measures cost time and money, Lucius only shrugged. "I will lose more if my workers fall ill," he replied simply. His apprentices, 2 boys barely into their teens, watched him carefully. They learned to wash their hands between customers, to sprinkle vinegar water over the counters, to keep their breathing steady even when they felt fear. But Lucius was not content with caution alone. Each evening, after the market closed, he walked to the small shrine of Salus, goddess of health, near the Circus Maximus. There he left modest offerings: a pinch of salt, a sprig of rue, a copper coin. It was not that he believed the goddess would spare him in particular. Rather, he believed that making the gesture affirmed a truth he valued, that every life depended on forces beyond calculation. When the fever reached its peak, foot traffic in the Forum dwindled. Some merchants closed their stalls entirely. Lucius kept his open, though he no longer haggled with customers. Prices remained steady. Those who could not pay in coin brought him tokens: a length of dyed wool, a bundle of dried figs, and he accepted them without complaint. One afternoon, an old woman approached his stall, wrapped in a cloak despite the summer heat. Her face was sallow, her breath shallow. She set down a small basket of cracked walnuts. "I have no money," she rasped, "but my grandson has not eaten in 2 days." Lucius weighed the walnuts and nodded. Without a word, he filled a sack with barley meal and dried lentils and pressed it into her hands. She tried to protest, but he only raised a hand. "If we must survive," he said, "we survive together." That evening, as he packed away the day's remaining goods, he felt the weariness of the long weeks settle into his bones. But he also felt a quiet steadiness. He had done what he could. In the weeks that followed, his apprentices fell ill in turn. Lucius moved them into a corner of the stall where he could keep watch. He boiled water with mint and honey, coaxed them to sip when they were able, and wiped their faces with cloths steeped in vinegar. At night, he slept on the floor nearby. He knew he might catch the fever himself. But he would not abandon the boys. They had come to him as strangers, sold to his service when their families could no longer feed them. Lucas said when the families could no longer feed them, over time, they had become something more, a responsibility he did not take lightly. When at last their fevers broke, he gave thanks at the shrine of Salus. His offering that morning was simple: a fresh loaf of bread and a scattering of crushed bay leaves. He whispered no elaborate prayers. Gratitude, he believed, needed no ornament. As the season waned, the Forum came back to life. Merchants returned to their stalls, Customers resumed their haggling, but many remembered how Lucius had kept his trade steady, how he had given food without demand, how he had burned sweet herbs to cleanse the air. One afternoon, a neighboring olive seller approached him with a small gift, a jar of pressed oil, richer than any Lucius could have afforded on his own. "For your kindness," the man said gruffly, as if embarrassed by his own sentiment. Lucius accepted it with a nod. He said nothing, but in his heart he felt something ease, a quiet proof that decency, practiced without expectation, did not go unnoticed. Years later, when the fever returned in another summer, Lucius was an old man. He no longer kept his own stall, but he came each morning to sit on a bench nearby. He watched the new generation of merchants, some cautious, some careless, and he felt a small, persistent hope that the lessons of that earlier season would not be forgotten. And when young traders sought his counsel, he always gave the same advice: keep your stall clean, treat your workers as you would your own children, and when fear rises, do not bargain with your heart. Chapter 14. The Midwives' Watch. Beyond the clamorous heart of Rome, in a neighborhood of modest insulae and narrow lanes, there was a house where midwives gathered during the fever seasons. It belonged to a widow named Clodia, who had delivered more infants than any physician could count. Though she was old and her hands trembled slightly, her mind remained clear as water from a cold spring. In times of pestilence, she opened her doors to the younger midwives, knowing that illness struck newborns and mothers alike, and that preparation could mean the difference between life and loss. Her house was plain, whitewashed walls, low wooden stools, a hearth always warm. Yet within those walls lay a kind of invisible refuge, built not of stone or wealth, but of shared knowledge. Each morning, the midwives assembled in her kitchen to review the cases of the night before. They spoke in low voices about which families had fallen sick, which births had gone well, which children had been spared or taken. Nothing was hidden, for they believed that truth, even when painful, was the first step in understanding. Clodia kept a ledger, much like the physicians did. In it, she wrote details of each birth: the position of the moon, the herbs used in the bath, the first cries of the child, and any signs of fever. She believed no scrap of knowledge was too small to record. Though she was not formally schooled, her experience had grown into its own kind of expertise. Younger midwives often said she could sense trouble before it showed itself. They trusted her instincts more than any augury. When the fever grew worse, Clodia taught them her simplest rituals, practical measures that might not cure, but could comfort. She showed them how to steep linen in vinegar and lavender water, how to keep the air moving through the birthing rooms, how to wash the mother's hands and face with clean cloths between each contraction. One afternoon, a young midwife named Tullia arrived at the house in tears. She had attended a birth in a cramped tenement where the fever had already claimed 2 children. The newborn was frail, and the mother lay pale and shivering. Tullia feared she had failed them both. Clodia listened without interruption. When the young woman's voice fell silent, she laid a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you could," she said softly. "Sometimes that is all the fates allow." That night, Clodia prepared a small pot of broth steeped with hyssop and garlic. She pressed it into Tullia's hands. "Take this to her," she said. "Sit beside her until morning. The fever will do what it will, but she will not face it alone." Tullia nodded, wiping her eyes. She returned at dawn, weary but steadier. The mother had survived the night. The child still breathed. Over the weeks, word spread through the neighborhood. If fever struck, Clodia's house would not close its doors. Expectant mothers came seeking advice, and sometimes simply the reassurance of her calm presence. She welcomed them all, arranging stools by the hearth, offering broth and cool cloths for their brows. More timely, however, Clodia's house would offer the same comfort to its mother. "I think the son coming is a promise," Clodia said. Expectant mothers came seeking advice, and sometimes simply the reassurance of her calm presence. She welcomed them all, arranging stools by the hearth, offering broth and cool cloths for their. Among those who came was a young patrician woman whose family had lost 3 infants in as many years. She arrived in a litter, too weak to walk. Clodia led her to the quietest room and sat with her through the afternoon heat. She did not offer grand promises. Instead, she spoke gently of small things, how the child within her might quicken soon, how the earliest morning light fell across the tiled floor, how the scent of crushed mint could ease a troubled stomach. In time, the woman's breathing grew less shallow. When she returned home, she left behind a slender gold bracelet in thanks. Clodia did not sell it. She placed it on a shelf near the ledger, a silent witness that wealth and poverty alike bent before the same sickness. As the fever ebbed with the turn of the season, Clodia gathered the midwives one last time. They sat in a circle as she read aloud from her ledger, recounting each case they had tended. Yave Ricini, Addison and Tison, Centin. There were successes and losses alike. When she finished, she closed the book and looked around the quiet room. "You have learned more than I could ever teach," she said, "and you will teach others in turn." No one spoke. In the hush, they felt the weight of what they had endured together. The nights without sleep, the moments of fear, the quiet triumphs when a child's first cry broke the darkness. Years later, when Clodia was gone and her house had passed to other hands, the ledger remained. Midwives continued to add to it, filling its pages with the unadorned stories of each birth, each fever, each fragile recovery. By then, the city had known many other scourges. Yet the ledger stood as proof that care had never ceased, that in every season there were hands willing to hold and voices willing to reassure, even when the outcome was uncertain. And so Clodia's quiet legacy endured, not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the countless lives that had begun and survived under her watch. Chapter 15. The Return of the Cool Winds. By the time the first cool winds curled through the streets of Rome, the fever had begun to loosen its hold. No trumpet announced its departure, no sudden miracle banished it. Rather, it receded as it had come, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning people realized they could breathe a little easier. Along the riverbank, fishermen who had stayed away during the worst weeks returned to mend their nets. Children who had been kept indoors came out into the pale sunlight. Merchants reopened their shuttered stalls, sweeping away the drift of dry leaves that had gathered while business lay still. The city resumed its rhythm, but everyone carried the memory of what had passed. In the temple of Aesculapius on Tiber Island, the priests offered a final season's libation. Wine poured over the worn altar stones. Patients who had recovered sat in the colonnade, watching the ripples of the river and wondering how such an ordinary morning could feel so miraculous. Attendants carried away empty cots and burned the last of the used bedding. The smell of juniper smoke drifted into the bright air. Among those who had survived was Septimus Labeo, the scholar who had once come to the temple with little faith and left with quiet resolve. He walked the gardens slowly, touching each laurel bush, the smooth curve of each marble column, as if to reassure himself the place was real. He knew he would never look upon the island the same way again. In its quiet watchfulness, it had become more than sanctuary. It had become proof that even in terror, humanity could find dignity. Farther inland, in the Sabura district, Alea the potter's wife scrubbed her walls one last time. Though the air no longer stank of illness, her neighbors passed by her door with nods of respect. She had been the one who held vigil for the sick when no physician came, who cleaned, fed, and comforted without expectation of reward. The girl she had taken in now followed at her side, carrying fresh rushes to lay on the floor. Life resumed its shape, if not quite the same as before. In the forum, Lucius Vinicius sat at the threshold of his reopened stall. The apprentices he had nursed back from the brink now tended customers with the same steady composure he had taught them. When asked why he had kept trading when so many fled, Lucius only smiled and said, "Because hunger does not wait for fear to pass." But those who had watched him knew the truth. He had traded not just in grain and oil, but in the small acts of decency that kept despair at bay. At the shrine of Salus, where offerings had piled high through the fever season, the priests gathered to clear the altars. They carried away with reverence the wilted garlands, the cracked figurines, the coins dulled by exposure. Nothing was discarded carelessly. Each object represented a plea, a moment of courage, or a wish too tender to be spoken aloud. Together, they were the testament of a city that refused to surrender. As dusk fell over Rome, the first real chill of autumn drifted in. People lit lamps and small hearth fires, not to drive out sickness, but simply for comfort. In that soft light, families gathered, grateful for the familiar rituals. Bread broken at the table, wine shared among hands that had once trembled. Cassia Valeria's name was spoken in many households, though she herself no longer walked the gardens of the temple. Some believed her spirit lingered in the place she had loved, that her patience and kindness had soaked into the very stones. Whether or not that was true, the attendants she had trained carried forward her quiet discipline, her belief that no life was too small to merit care. On the hill above the city, Clodia's ledger rested in its cabinet. The last entry in her own hand noted simply, "The fever eased with the coming of cool winds." A later scribe had added, "And so we begin again." For begin again they did. Rome had never been a city that expected permanence. Fires would come, floods would rise, sickness would return. And yet, in every season of trial, the same qualities surfaced: compassion, courage, the willingness to tend one another when no cure was certain. In time, poets and historians wrote of that particular season, though their verses often focused on the grander gestures: processions to the temples, decrees from the Senate, the spectacle of civic rituals. Less often did they note the humbler truths, that survival was carried out in kitchens, in sick rooms, in the hands of ordinary people, doing what they could. For those who had lived through it, the memory remained a quiet inheritance. It taught them that healing could be as much about presence as medicine, about bearing witness when others turned away. And so, as the days shortened and the nights grew cold, the people of Rome took stock. They buried their dead, tended the weak, and cleaned their homes. They did not declare victory. There was no such thing over nature itself. But they did reclaim the rhythms of life, one measured step at a time. In the mornings, when dawn spread its pale light across the Tiber, traders carried baskets to the markets. Children followed, bright-eyed and curious. The city's voices rose again, no longer the hush of fear, but the ordinary music of survival. And if you walked through those lanes and paused to listen, you would hear it. Not a hymn or a decree, but the simple, unremarkable sounds that told the story best of all. Laughter, footsteps, the creak of shutters thrown open to greet the returning sun.